Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the Experts. I'm Rachel Landry, and today I'm joined by my colleague Scott Weber, a quality assurance specialist here at the company. Today, Scott will be talking to us about the forward and inverse jobs in Geographic Calculator. All right, Scott, take it away.
Today we're going to take a look at forward and inverse calculations. What are they? Who uses them? And how do you perform them in Geographic Calculator? Here's a simple diagram that illustrates a forward and inverse calculation. On the forward side, we have three things in blue that are known items: a coordinate, a distance, and an azimuth. And that azimuth is either from true north or grid north, depending on your coordinate system. And what we want to find out with a forward is the coordinate at the end of that path once we've traveled the distance and azimuth. In an inverse, we have the endpoints, the two coordinates, the ends, and we want to know what is the distance between them and what is the azimuth of that line. Now, there are three kinds of paths you can take to traverse that distance. And here's a simple diagram or map. I've plotted 2 points very far apart to exaggerate the difference between the three kinds of lines. We have a rhumb line, which is a line of constant compass direction, a geodesic line, which is a great circle line, and then a grid line, which is particular to a given map projection, and it is simply a straight line in that Cartesian grid space of the projection. A grid line in this particular Robinson projection really doesn't make a lot of sense, but just here for illustrative purposes. In Geographic Calculator, well, first I should say, surveyors use forward and inverses most commonly when they have a traverse. You can use forward or inverse to check your calculations or do some of the calculations. But there are many places where forward and inverse calculations come in handy in geodesy and geographic type work. So in Geographic Calculator, there are two jobs that can do forward and inverse calculations. First, the interactive conversion job, which does one calculation at a time. And then there's the point database forward inverse job, which can do forward and inverse calculations on a spreadsheet of data, operating on each row of a spreadsheet. So let's take a look at an interactive forward conversion first. So first we need to select the operation type to forward, and then we enter a coordinate, and the coordinate system matters here. So I have WGS 84 geodetic selected, and I have that selected on both sides. So my input coordinate is going to be lat lon, and my output is also going to be lat lon. And then I also enter a distance and an azimuth of the path that I want to travel to the output point. Now, one thing to note is that all forward inverse calculations have to have the same datum on both sides. Both coordinates have to be in the same datum. So if I click calculate, I get an output coordinate over here on the right, and that is the final point, traveling a distance of 1,000 meters at an azimuth of 45 degrees from 40 degrees north, 93 west. Now I can mix my coordinate systems. So in this example, still a forward calculation, still the same input point in a geodetic coordinate system, but I've changed my target coordinate system to a UTM zone 15 north, which is what this particular geodetic point is going to fall into. Still WGS 84, so I'm allowed to do this calculation, but my output, when I hit calculate, it's the same distance and azimuth. Now my coordinate is in UTM 15 north, so that's handy. And then finally, we'll look at an interactive inverse. Now I've selected the inverse operation type, and I've entered the same source coordinate on the left, but now I've entered a coordinate on the right-hand side, which is actually the output from that forward calculation that we did first. And calculating this inverse job is going to fill in the distance and azimuth in the middle. Again, same datum on both sides. I calculate, and I get back that original distance and azimuth that I started with in my original forward job. The back azimuth is a little bit off from 180, different from the azimuth. That's to be expected when you're working with a geodesic line. Now let's look at the point database forward inverse job where we can work on spreadsheet data. I've loaded in some forward input, so I have latitude, longitude columns and distance and azimuth columns. I'm working in WGS84 Geodetic, and I've pre-filled in all the columns, latitude, longitude, distance, azimuth, to save some time. Again, my method is geodesic, and I have 2 blank columns, lat out, lon out, for the output. And preview those. And now we have a forward calculation for every row in the spreadsheet. I should note that there is a toggle here for forward versus inverse, and I had that set to forward, which is the default. Another forward job, this one works on a series of distances and azimuths from an initial point. So I have 1 latitude and longitude, and then I'm going to keep marching away from that a certain distance at a certain azimuth until I hit the end of the spreadsheet. So to do this, it's set up exactly the same as before, except over on the right, I've clicked Use Output Point as Next Input Point. So that is going to fill in the blank rows and columns in the sheet, like so. Now an inverse job. I've loaded a little bit different kind of data where now I have 2 sets of coordinates, my endpoints that I want to calculate the distance and azimuth between them. I have to select inverse from that drop down now instead of forward. And notice that these data are geodetic on one set of columns and the others are in UTM. So I've selected the UTM just like we did in that inverse job previously. I've selected all my columns. Things are in a little bit different order here because the output are always over on the right. And one thing I've had to be careful here is that these UTM coordinates are in US Survey feet. So I had to select that specifically to make sure that was correct. And when I preview this, it's going to fill in those distances and azimuths in the middle columns. Now, there's one other option that I won't go into now, but just like that inverse where we had the blank lines and we filled them in just using the distance and azimuths, you can do a commensurate operation in the inverse side, doing the same thing where you use one row's coordinates and you calculate the distance and azimuth to the next row's coordinates instead of having all the data on one row. So that's a quick overview of forward and inverse and the 2 jobs that do those calculations. I'm planning on doing a follow-up Ask the Experts, getting a little more into detail on the different paths, geodesic, RUM, and grid, and height above the ellipsoid calculations and how those interact with each other. So stay tuned for a future installment.
Scott, thank you so much for talking to us about the forward and inverse conversion jobs in Geographic Calculator. I know that our users will find that very interesting. If you're interested in learning more about Geographic Calculator, please visit bluemarblegeo.com today. And as always, thank you for joining us for this episode of Ask the Experts, and we hope to see you next time.